The SEC and the Big Ten are now meeting with the Big 12 to demand we give up our bye in the college football playoff. Here's why we won't. This is a Locked On Big 12, Locked On Utes crossover.
You are Locked On Big 12, your daily podcast on the Big 12 Conference. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Happy Collusion, everybody. Welcome to a Locked On Big 12, Locked On Utes crossover. I'm Drake Toll from America's #1 Big 12 podcast. Locked On Big 12, that's JT Wistrcill, who is co-hosting today because he's very attractive and mildly funny. We will cover the SEC and the Big Ten.
I'm clipping that.
They're taking a new step toward running the college football playoff and actually asking the Big 12 to effectively forfeit a bye by seeding it 1 through 12 without a conference champion getting said bye. We would lose a lot of money in that scenario. We'll talk about that. And we'll also get into both the leagues are tampering. They brought lawyers in the room to try to keep from colluding. And when you're bringing lawyers in the room to be careful what you say, you're probably trying to bounce around tampering. Then we'll finish with the entire state of Utah running Kansas. Utah and BYU both destroying the Jayhawks. Is the basketball season coming to an end for Kansas? Is this Bill Self's worst year? We'll get through all of that. If you hit subscribe, we get to keep our job. It has been Dellinger report after Dellinger report coming out about the SEC, the Big Ten meeting in the last few weeks and discussing what they want to do with the future of the college football playoff. And JT, they don't have the Big 12. They don't have the ACC or anybody else in these rooms. They've decided they want to go to a new format that takes away the bye for conference champions. Now, Brett Yormark and Jim Phillips of the ACC have both said this is very stupid. We would lose a lot of money. We know there's a bias toward the SEC. We know there's a bias toward the Big Ten. If we just seed them 1 through 12, that's who's going to get the bye every year, teams from those two leagues. And we have the power to say no to this. We can, when the SEC pitches this and says, Big 12, we want you to take a back seat, we can say no. It has to be a unanimous vote to approve this. I just don't understand why these two leagues are going to craft something that kills everybody else and think we're going to say yes.
Yeah, that's what's nice is you mentioned they can say no, the Big 12 can, and the ACC could too, for 1 year. We'll get 1 year of this, but then the problem is the power still resides with the Big 10 and the SEC, and a year from now, or just a year from now, after this following year's playoff, then we are going to see them make it to where we do away with the auto bids. But at least for this next year, Drake, I'll let you dive into the financial ramifications of why the Big 12 will not in the 2025-26 playoff want to give up the auto bid. But also, like, let's just think about how stupid that would be for the Big 12. Like for Brett Yormark to go in and be like, we're guaranteed an auto bid or we have a great chance at an auto bid. Should say that because we saw last year what happened in the ACC where Boise State ends up climbing up, right? So crazy things can happen, but we have a great chance at a top 4 seed. Why in the world would you give that up? That doesn't make any sense from a competitive standpoint. Brett Yormark's not going to give this up for a year, and I'm glad that Brett Yormark, Jim Phillips at least have a year where they can stand up to the Big Ten and the SEC because that is quickly going away. So it makes no sense from a competitive standpoint why we would give up a great opportunity for a bye when more times than not, we probably are going to see the top 4 teams not representing a Big 12 team. And yes, it can happen. Sometimes I do believe that could happen, but more times than not, it's probably not going to be. So why would you give yourself up a great advantage of getting into that top grouping? They're not going to do that. And that's without even factoring in what you could dive into. The financial ramifications would make it like just even more idiotic for Brett Yormark to just lay down and be like, oh, sure, we'll do this now.
I know you don't flex it very often. It's not something to flex, but you have a very close relationship with the conference commissioner, and so you get to see this from a commissioner's point of view a lot of the time. And JT, what I'm worried about is the SEC and Big Ten know that next year they have even more power, that they're going to change the format from 2026 through 2031, and those two leagues basically have all the saying power in that conversation. So my worry is they're coming with a bogus, crazy, wild suggestion here, knowing the Big 12 will say no. So in a year's time, when they're building their own college football playoff, they can look back at the Big 12 and say, remember when you wouldn't work with us? Remember when you wouldn't negotiate? Remember when you shot us down? This just feels like a negotiation tactic a year in advance that's going to put the Big 12 in a bad spot if they don't somehow just bow to the man, the SEC and the Big 10, knowing they have all the power in the world to do whatever they want in 365 days.
Yeah, I think it definitely can be that. Here's what's really tough is, and maybe it will be a negotiation tactic, and just a year from now, they're going to try and do something crazy. But I look at it like this. I think the SEC and the Big Ten will at least understand, as mad as they'll be about it, why the playoff won't change the next year. But then after that, they're going to get their way. I would be shocked if the four, and I said we're going to have a squad show coming out. I think the four auto bids for the SEC and the Big Ten, I genuinely believe would be the worst thing that's ever happened to college football, what happens on the field at least. So I think it would be terrible for the sport, but I also don't know what the Big 12, what the ACC can do, because what is the Big Ten and SEC's threat that they can also throw at the NCAA? Well, we'll just leave and make our own playoff. So that's where they're kind of stuck of, hey, we could stand up to them a little bit, but a year from now, if they do come back and say, well, here's how it's going to work moving forward. We're going to get 4 auto bids. You guys will each at least get 2 auto bids, but we're going to get the top auto bids, and we think that's at least fair. They have to play ball with them, because at the end of the day, the SEC and the Big Ten could walk away, and I think that's the threat. And how all that works, I'm not entirely sure because of all the legal ramifications, but there are just growing rumors and concerns of super conferences and them trying to potentially separate. So this could all get very messy, but I don't think it would, because as much as it frustrates me that the Big 12 and the ACC are going to basically have to bow down to the SEC and Big 10, that's probably where we're heading for.
Yeah, no doubt. I mean, those are the 2 leagues that control everything right now. It's the money in 2026 or 25, I should say, that Brett Yormark wants to keep in pocket. Dellinger's quoted saying, why would the Big 12, ACC, and many of the Group of 5 commissioners, the main benefactors of the rule, vote for such a move? They wouldn't. Some of them have hinted as much in comments to Yahoo Sports in the last month. Brett Yormark saying, I do not have the appetite to give up any financial reward that comes with a bye, alluding to the $8 million reward earned by a team that automatically advances to the quarterfinals. Jim Phillips says, it's not as if this system is so foreign. This shouldn't be as a convenient rationale. It deserves a review, and we should talk about how it went, but it's not some exotic structure in giving conference champions a bye in a playoff format. The NFL does that. That's the highest level of football, and they're going to give division champions a bye going to the playoffs. Brett Yormark and Jim Phillips are saying, if they can do it, if the highest level of football can do it, we should do it too. And my only pushback there is it doesn't matter what we say. Again, in a year's time, I think this is all just kind of a moot point.
Yeah, it feels that way, because I'm even like trying to, let's say Iowa State. Let's pick the Cyclones, right? If they go 11-1, we all know what the argument's still going to be. Oh, but they didn't do it against Ohio State. They didn't do it against Georgia. So are they really one of the 4 best teams? And they're going to try to tear the argument apart and just tear them down. So it feels like it's going to be very hard, unless a team goes genuinely undefeated in the regular season, that we're going to see a Big 12 team or even an ACC team get a bye once this does eventually change. And I will say, like, I do feel like I don't have a problem with us rewarding the top 4 seeds just in general, like saying, hey, I'm always been a proponent of the best. Now, where I get frustrated is the SEC and even the Big Ten at times want to slant it just to make it the best is always them. But I am totally for the 4 best teams get by. I just want that evaluated fairly. I can even say, as the Utah guy, BYU, I wish, got a little bit more of a shake in the discussions for that final CFP spot. I know they were up there they were down at 18, but I think they at least belonged in the discussion more. So that's what I want to see change. But I am not opposed to the top 4 teams getting there. My concern is just the top 4 teams of, even when it's close between a Big 12 team, an SEC team, and a Big 10 team, we pretty much know they're always going to slant, and that's what I don't like.
Coming up, tampering. This screams of tampering. This is a Locked On Big 12 Locked On Utes crossover, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Today's show is brought to you by FanDuel. FanDuel is exactly where I go when the game tips off in the NBA or college basketball. And as it's just getting started, there's no better place than FanDuel, America's #1 sports book. With FanDuel, you can place live bets throughout the game. So even if you miss the opening tip-off or want to bet a fourth quarter comeback, stay in on the action. If you're looking for a bigger payout, same game parlays are also available live as well. I love FanDuel's betting feature because it keeps every moment exciting. I know, hey, my favorite team's down by 6 with 4 minutes to go. We're going to come back and win. If I miss my chance pregame to bet it, I can bet it live. Right now, new FanDuel customers get $150 in bonus bets if your first $5 bet wins. Visit FanDuel.com to join today. It's FanDuel.com for your shot at $150 in bonus bets. Make every moment more with FanDuel, the official sports betting partner of the NBA. JT Wistrcill of Locked On Utes. JT, this is a great tweet from Bill Connolly with ESPN, who's quote tweeting Heather Dinich, who brings up a lot of great points about the SEC and the Big Ten and where they want the college football playoff to go. And Connolly points out, and I quote, attorneys for both leagues will be present as they want to be very careful to avoid anything that can be construed as collusion. Connolly then says, have to wonder how collusion would look different than what they have done over the last year. These two leagues are walking into a room, shutting the door, not allowing the Mountain West, the Big 12, the ACC in there, and making every decision about the future of college football without anyone else. That's what tampering is. That's what they are colluding to take the sport in a direction that doesn't feature everyone else at the table.
I think this is really complicated of where they could, like, could the ACC, could the Big 12 actually say, hey, you're colluding against us, like, we're going to take you to court and all this. Unfortunately, I don't think it would work and hold up, because you make a really, like, are they not including them in those meetings in terms of not inviting them? Yes, but it's not like they're necessarily like, oh, hey, like, we're keeping you out, like, you're trying to get into this and we're actively keeping you out of it, in terms of they're generally meeting without them. Yes, but they're not locking them out per se, like in the literal definition of it. So this is where the legal jargon all gets really tough. So I doing my best to do I know, Drake, you always do a great job of leading through all the legal documents. So I give you a lot of credit and props to that. So I did a little bit of digging my own. I looked up the definition of collusion. It's an illegal cooperation or conspiracy, especially in order to cheat or deceive others. So cheat or deceive is very intriguing, because that's maybe what's going on, although I don't know if it's actually cheating and deceiving as much as it is. And I don't like this at all. I want to make that very clear. But I do feel like this is the Big Ten, the SEC, trying to maximize the value that they have brought to college football. And I don't love that, once again, but the top brands in the sport do reside in the Big Ten, the SEC. So if they walk in and say, hey, we bring the most money, we deserve the most money, and we deserve the most auto bids, I don't like that, but I'm not sure that's enough to say, hey, we're taking you to court. That's colluding, because if we went to court, they could literally say, here are the ratings in which our games generate the most revenue and things of that nature. So that's where I have a hard time seeing how it would hold up in court, but I haven't even watched Law and Order, so I can't get too deep into all this.
Yeah, I'm steadily trying to understand, as a journalism major from Baylor, what exactly the collusion side of this would be and how you prove that. Yes. You know, as a college football fan, I think the first thing I want to consider this as is collusion, because I know it's to the detriment of certain aspects of this sport, of the reason we love this sport, of the competitive equality that every university has in college football that is going away with revenue sharing, NIL, the transfer portal. I mean, things are getting crazier and crazier. And what is even scarier than 2025, this is a direct quote from Dinich's article, the CFP conversations unfolding across all leagues are twofold. Possible changes for 2025, which would have to be unanimous, and more significant changes for 2026, which don't have to be unanimous. The SEC and the Big Ten are discussing both, with seeding at the top of the list as a potential quick fix for this fall, if every other conference and Notre Dame agreed to it. That 2026 part we kind of brushed over in the ESPN article. These two leagues are in meetings right now where they're discussing the future of the college football playoff. Like that is, in a year's time, whatever the SEC wants to do. If that's 4 automatic bids, 5 automatic bids, the Big 12 gets 1, the Big 12 gets 2. They're going to move forward with that. They're trying to basically take everybody else out of college football, it feels like.
It absolutely feels that way. And that's where it's frustrating. And I'm just really hoping that they do at least want to continue this playoff of including the ACC, the Big 12, a group of 5 team. But I will say this, like, what were to happen if a group of 5 team upset a Big 10 or an SEC team? Would they look at this from a financial standpoint and be like, why are we even risking this when we could just have our own teams playing against each other and maybe eventually separate? It does feel like we're heading for super conferences. If you said to me, are the Big 10 and the SEC affiliated with the NCAA in 10 years? For the first time, well, I guess the couple of years has been talked about, but like really, it doesn't feel like that's a for sure thing anymore, which is a very scary future. And the fact that that could be a reality, it does feel like they want to separate themselves more from all other leagues. They want to keep all of the revenue as much as they can for themselves. I mean, this is a greed move, right? Like, if this is not what's good for college football, I can't be the only one when I said like, hey, this would be awful for the sport, the competitive nature of it. We're just going to allow 4 SEC and 4 Big Ten teams in just because. Like, that's not what's good for what we all love about college football, but it's very good for the SEC and the Big Ten, what is good for those brands to make playoffs, win playoff games, and win national championships. And what's the way you get all of that? By automatically getting more teams into that field. And that's what they want to propose. And I really wish they could stand in their way, but I don't feel like the Big 12 and the ACC are equipped to. I really don't like the direction college football is heading in, Drake. I'm very concerned, and I feel like we are going to end up seeing the SEC and the Big 10 winning. They're going to get their auto bids, and I'm just hoping now that we continue to have games like Texas, Arizona State, like where those teams get to play each other. Hopefully Arizona State ends up on top too, but I want those teams to continue to play each other. My fear is someday we would have 2 separate ones or maybe a super conference. I don't know. There are a lot of outcomes, and I don't like most of them.
No, the other quote that stood out to me is one in the ESPN article from an ACC source saying, it does become a little bit of an invitational. Will there be circumstances where a Big 12 or ACC might have 3 really good and deserving teams to come in, and all of a sudden these spots are taken up through other teams from the SEC or the Big 10? That's a difficult one. I also understand that who has the gold makes a little bit of the rules, right? And that's what this is like, the manifest destiny of college football, where you kind of sit down and shut up because you have to, because dad's got the speaking stick. And when he's got the talking stick, that's who's going to have to lay down the law. I just, maybe the craziest part of this whole deal is, to me, it's not just the SEC and the Big 10, but the entity that has the contract through 2031 for the college football playoff, ESPN.
Yeah.
You know they have a say in this. They have like $1 billion per year investment in this. You know that ESPN is pulling the strings behind the scenes, and they probably themselves want to see more SEC and Big Ten teams in there.
Potentially. I will say, I'm trying to remember now if it was, I think it was the Ross Dellinger one, Drake, that he said ESPN does not feel great about auto bids just for hurting the competitive nature of the product, because that is something that's really dangerous. And Drake, I brought this up before. Like, if you're the SEC and the Big Ten, why are you trying to make yourselves look bad? Drake, out of 10 playoffs, like, let's just predict, how many of those playoffs, like 10 different playoffs, how many of them would not include 4 SEC and 4 Big Ten teams? Like, just how, if that was just if it was a 16 team field, like how many of those would not include 8 teams? Like,
probably few, probably very few.
So why are we doing this on the risk? Like, I'm sorry, Alabama, you're one team, like Alabama, Ole Miss. Like, I'm sorry, the SEC, you only got 3 teams in this year, and you still got 3 really good teams in. Like, you're fine. Whatever other team we let in too, they're not going to make the natty. It's just, I guess that's where it just becomes the money deal, because then it's like, well, if we beat another team, we're still earning more money. So I guess that's where it becomes frustrating. But I'm not trying to defend ESPN too much here either, because we know that the destruction of the Pac-12, ESPN was very much involved in that. We've heard all the reports and everything too, like from the negotiations and everything that started there too. So the reason that conference realignment and we're in this position and everything, the TV networks play a massive role in that. This is such a complicated and complex thing. And it's just amazing, Drake. I mean, you and I have been with this network for a couple of years, and we talked about conference realignment a little bit, but to now be talking about the TV deals and auto bids, it just changes every year so much. It's wild.
Every offseason's crazy. There's always something that's not good. Coming up, this is good if you're a Utah or BYU fan. The state of Utah owns Kansas in basketball. Who saw that coming? This is a Locked On Big 12 Locked On Utes crossover. JT Wistrcill of Locked On Utes. Utah and BYU both own Kansas in basketball. The Jayhawks are spinning, and Utah basketball is an afterthought in the Big 12 for the most part, and now all of a sudden they're up there in the middle of the pack. And BYU basketball a couple of weeks ago was, will they be an NCAA tournament team? They went and routed Kansas 91-57. This is the death of the Jayhawks, who will drop out of the top 25, and the birth of basketball in Utah in the Big 12.
Yeah, you only highlighted Kansas, but I see you back there, Kansas State, too, because they also got their butts kicked, and a lot of people are making a push to try and get them in the tournament. What Utah and BYU both did is incredibly impressive. I will say, I think Utah's a fascinating conversation because their coach is on the hot seat, Craig Smith. I think he has a chance to keep his job. That's how big the Kansas and Kansas State wins were for him. Obviously, Kevin Young's fine. He's doing a good job. Yeah. It's his first year, and there's so much that's going to go into next year anyways, too. That's what a lot of BYU fans are waiting for. Even if they want to be successful this year, make the tournament, do all the things of that nature. What does these wins say about these teams? I actually think it says what we've known about them all year. They're really good at home. They're 27-5 combined at home. Utah is 14-3 in the Huntsman. BYU is 13-2 in the Marriott Center. So why do teams struggle to come out to play in Utah? And this actually isn't just a basketball conversation. Most years, it didn't work out so well this year for Utah football because of how bad their offense was. But most years, it's just really hard to come into Utah and win in general, for whether that be for Utah football or BYU has had a very good home field advantage too. What is the reason for that? The altitude is a legit thing there. You see teams get fatigued and worn down. And what happens when you get fatigued and worn down? You make mistakes that are uncharacteristic. Kansas turned it over 15 times against BYU. Uncharacteristic for them because they were fatigued, and it's hard to play in that altitude too. Also, the new travel schedule, that's something that definitely factors into this too, having to make their way out for a long trip in Utah as well too. So look, it just gets really hard. The altitude, to keep the conditioning up, you make mistakes, and I give a lot of credit to Utah and BYU for what they did to Kansas. I will say really quick about Kansas, this comes to us from ESPN. This was Kansas' 7th loss in which they have been ranked and lost to an unranked team, which is their most such losses in the AP era. That goes back to pre-1950. So it also shows you good on Utah and BYU. They're stepping up. They're doing good things right now. Kansas has a legit problem.
That is one of the wildest. Like, that's not even Bill Self. That's every era of Kansas basketball, basically, and even past the modern era. They have somehow been. They're struggling to make the NCAA tournament, but this year, it's like Kansas has hit a wall. Self said in his post-game press conference, we thought this would be a bonding trip. We'll go to Utah for a week, 9 days, whatever it ends up being. We'll find ourselves, and it'll be a fun kumbaya for all of our guys. And then he goes into the presser and says, we all need to get away from each other. We all need to be as far away from each other as possible and end this. Did the state of Utah break Kansas basketball?
I think they might have been the final push. Did other people land the punches and then Utah came in for that big cinematic blow that's going to Utah and BYU to knock them out? I think that is absolutely possible because I just feel like this is a team that's teetering. There's been some really interesting Hunter Dickinson comments throughout the season. He's got that weird deal where he's also a CBS analyst too. So this is a very weird team. And sometimes we see the guys who stay in college forever. Doesn't always end so well. Cam Rising, Alan Bowman, KJ Jefferson. Some of them it works great, but not all these guys it does. So I really do think there's a chance. I think both Utah and BYU are playing their best basketball right now. Now, part of that is they're at home, so I want to see how they're going to fare on the road coming up here. Also really excited for Utah and BYU to face off down the stretch in the regular season final game. That was an awesome atmosphere last night the Cougars had. To Drake, that was just incredibly exciting. I'm sure Jake Hatch was there too. So it was an incredibly exciting atmosphere. I do think Utah and BYU in part have they damaged Kansas badly. And even Kansas State, they were expected to do more. I'm blanking on his name now, Drake, but they had the big transfer from Illinois they got. And he is, I think it's Coleman Hawkins. I want to say it is. And he was struggling for the Wildcats too. So it's wild to see Utah step up and be a team that's Utah basketball, BYU basketball had expectations. For Utah basketball to go out and beat Kansas, that's why it's what's wrong with Kansas so much? And it's also wait, Craig Smith's a pretty good coach. Maybe we should keep him in Utah. So it was crazy to watch Utah and BYU be able to pull off the big upsets over the weekend. And BYU thrashed them. I mean, oh my gosh, it wasn't even a game in the second half.
Yeah. Coleman Hawkins, who? That's kind of what it's felt like in a few of these games here recently. JT, I want to talk Utah basketball, BYU basketball, holy war. It feels a lot less spicy. It feels a little more kind of the vibes that I've gotten so far is when Utah wins a basketball game against Kansas, BYU fans are going, good. We want Kansas to lose in basketball. Almost like there's a sense of somewhat camaraderie between the two. I could be reading this entirely wrong, but it feels like both schools are okay with each other winning in basketball. Is that true this season at least?
Feels like it. I think the Utah-BYU rivalry is very interesting because you mentioned how Bill Self talked about having a kumbaya when they came out to Utah. Drake, you were at the Utah-BYU football game. Would you describe that as a kumbaya?
No kumbaya. It's
No
not opposite of kumbaya.
No, opposite of kumbaya, exactly. I do think there is something to be said of the Utah-BYU rivalry is so fascinating and complex. We talked about the religious ramifications of it before too. And then you also look at I feel like some fans loathe the other school to an unhealthy level. And then some fans look at them like, I'm a Utah fan, but my second favorite team is BYU. So this rivalry becomes so complex and interesting. And with every state that anyone has ever lived in, there's always our state against the world or against everyone, right? So I do feel like there is that thing of, hey, Utah basketball, like Utah high school football was disrespected not long ago. Utah high school basketball is caught in some flat. So like anytime your state's being disrespected, you're going to want the teams in your state to perform, step up, and do some things. And that's what both Utah and BYU have been able to do in basketball. I think to be able to beat Kansas once again, like that's monumental. That's got to be. Utah beat Arizona a couple of years ago, but to beat a true blue blood like Kansas is an incredible feat for this Utah team and an incredible feat for BYU too. So it's not the same as football. What's interesting is there should be the same level of discuss because Chris Burgess, who's an assistant on BYU, he was with BYU a couple years ago. Then he went to Utah. Then he left and went back to BYU, and he took Keba Keita, the center on Utah last year, with the Cougars. So that's still a little bit of a rivalry there. But I have seen a lot of Utah and BYU fans almost just seems like uniting and just being like, this is awesome that we both beat the Kansas schools and knocked them down. So it's, the football fandom is always a little more intense, I think, just with every fan base. We've seen that in the Alabama Auburn basketball game. I even feel like too, it wasn't at the same level as the Iron Bowl is. But it does feel like with basketball, too, that both programs, because they've experienced some down play at times this year and maybe not, well, Utah surpassed expectations, but still a disappointment. I mean, that Houston game was just dreadful for Utah in basketball. And even BYU, they had their rough spots, too. So they were both a little bit down. And then they both get a major win. And so not all the fans are crazy about like their hate for the other school. So I think a lot of the ones in the middle that you see, and I myself included, I can be like, I really like BYU's open on ESPN last night was incredible with their student section, them panning to that. That was a great shot. I have a lot of respect for Kevin Young and the Cougars basketball program. And the intense hatred that sometimes goes to football, it's not there for basketball. It was, like you said, Drake, great week for Utah basketball. Not good for any basketball in the state of Kansas in the Big 12.
No, it was not. JT, where can more folks find your work?
You guys can head over Locked On Utes. Find my personal handle at JT Wistrcill, Locked On Utes on X as well. Drake, always great hanging with you, my friend. And also, you are a very handsome host as well.
Thank you very much. That's very sweet of you, JT. This has been and always will be Locked On. Thanks for making it your first listen every single day. Dose Grande.